Welcome to the Week Ahead, a podcast by SBM Intelligence. I'm your host, Veronica Pana Igube. Every Friday, we explore stories that are shaping our continent. Nigeria's government has announced a 6-month suspension on the export of shea nuts in a bid to encourage local value addition and stimulate domestic processing. How will this ban reshape the balance between exporters and local processors in the short term? The recent increase in the price of compressed natural gas is straining households and transport operators across Nigeria. Once seen as a cheaper alternative to petrol, CNG's rising cost is raising doubt about valuable its viability as a long-term solution to fuel affordability. Could this price hike slow down Nigeria's energy transition and push more citizens back to petrol use? Tidjane Thiam, former Credit Suisse CEO, has reaffirmed his determination to contest Ivory Coast 2025 presidential elections despite political pullbacks. Will his international reputation give him an edge in Ivory Coast's tense political landscape? Joining us today for further insights is Ayotunde Abiodun, analyst at SBM Intelligence. Welcome, Ayo, to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Veronica. It's always a pleasure to be here.
It's always a pleasure to have you as well. Let's start with the Nigerian shea nut export ban. Let's start by giving our listeners some context as to why the Nigerian government has banned the export of shea nuts, and what do you think will be the immediate impact this suspension is likely to have on farmers who depend on shea nut exports for income in Nigeria?
All right, a great point to start today's conversation. So, the Nigerian government has placed a 6-month suspension on raw shea nut exports, and the government's rationale is quite clear. So, the first reason is they want to stop the huge informal trade that drains about 90,000 tons of raw shea across our borders every year without adding much value locally. Also, beyond that, there's also the issue that domestic processors are working at about 30 to 50% of their installed capacity, um, which basically translates to the fact that they are not getting as much raw shea nuts as they should. So the government wants to ensure that these domestic processors get enough raw material to run closer to capacity. That is the reason why this ban has come into effect. Now, in terms of impact, at the immediate level, what we'll see is that farmers who depend on selling their shea nuts to foreign players, they will feel the pinch because that window is closed by the government. And if the domestic processors do not step in quickly to buy that surplus, to buy that supply from farmers, what will happen is that the farm gate price of shea nuts could drop, and these smallholders, the farmers, basically, many of them who are women in the rural areas, will be the ones to feel the brunt of this policy move. So, on paper, while this policy has strong industrial logic, there's a lot of risks for farmers in the short term if we don't see that transition, that the domestic processors will step up and buy out this supply.
So you talk of a lot on the domestic processors, but it's really important for us to analyze this point to know that do these local processors currently have the capacity to absorb the increase in this supply? I mean, you mentioned they would now have to buy out or become consumers, if I put it that way, of the gap that we're having from export. So the shea nuts that are not being exported will be bought by these local processors. But do they have the capacity to process? And will this lead to, obviously, loss for these producers? And kind of like in the long run, do you think this policy will stimulate real industrialization in the shea sector? Or is it simply a shift power from exporters to a few larger domestic processors as opposed to the small um, processors that we have that are benefiting from export?
All right, brilliant question, Veronica. So let's start with the data that we have. So on paper, it shows that these local processors have the capacity because reports are showing that these domestic players are running at about 35 to 50% of their installed capacity, basically translated to the fact that they do not get enough raw materials to play with, basically. So they are basically being underutilized. But in practice, it's not so straightforward. And why the policy move looks great on paper, we're not seeing accompanying policies that would ensure that this policy move translate to the intended objectives. So everybody will agree running a processing plant or even running a business in Nigeria comes with challenges. And the biggest challenge in that entire framework is energy costs. Energy costs are high, and financing is getting really scary in a place like Nigeria today, and logistics also remains a headache. So if these bottlenecks are not addressed, energy, the financing to run these processing plants, and the logistics, because as much as you even produce, do you have the logistics to supply the demand market? If these bottlenecks are not addressed, then these extra nuts that we're trying to safeguard will just pile up. And again, farmers will be forced to sell at lower prices, which basically translates to the fact that the policy does not meet its intended objective. So, and again, we should also understand the fact that this has been proven over time when government step in to ban raw materials. It only incentivizes smuggling, sort of. So again, a framework put in place to ensure that we don't see a lot of smuggling to neighboring countries. So if these other issues are not addressed, it's just a situation whereby the potential is there, but the infrastructure and policy support to match up this policy move do not exist.
Thank you, Ayo. I love that you pointed out like you need policies in making certain strategic reforms. You also need policies that will match it to say, what can we expect? What's the best thing we can expect to happen and what's the worst? And kind of like putting things to address it, right? So how do you, in a situation where you create a ban, like you said, there's going to be an effect of smuggling. So how do you address smuggling? It should be in your policy as well to say, as we abandon this, we project that people will try to smuggle, but in order to counter this, we have this strategy as well. So great point that you raised there. Let's move on to our second story where Nigeria is experiencing a CNG price hike, right? So as we know, when this present administration removed the fuel subsidy, there was also like kind of an introduction of CNG to say, okay, fuel prices are up. We're bringing this as a kind of backup just to cushion the fall for people to, move to CNG as it's cheaper. But now that people have moved to CNG, we're currently experiencing a hike. Um, how does this hike price affect public transportation operators who had already invested like in CNG? And why do you think we're seeing this? Because if CNG comes to the same price as fuel, don't you think that people would rather go back to the option of using fuel as opposed to CNG?
All right, that's a lot of questions, more developing. I'll try and take them bit by bit. So we've seen a price hike for CNG, and what's causing this price hike is simply the fact that there's some form of subsidy removal. So previously the government has been absorbing part of the cost to keep CNG more affordable, and so that bit of support has been withdrawn, and by extension, prices have climbed up. Uh, So, and there are a lot of related issues that comes with the subsidy removal. So there's the issue of operational costs. So things like transportation of the gas, the compression, the storage, maintenance, and again, energy costs. So one thing we must always realize is sometimes when we discuss business or economic issues in Nigeria, energy always has a way of showing its head, which basically just shows how important it is. So when you have all of these operational costs being on the upward trend, by extension, it becomes inconvenient for a government running subsidy regime to continue to pay subsidy on those resources, right? So that's really why we're seeing a price hike. Basically, the government is and basically withdrawing support in terms of financial commitment. And the report is to the effect, even though they've denied that the NNPC Gas Retail Limited was responsible for this price hike. They basically reduced subsidy. So there are a lot of intertwined issues in this. So first, again, is the issue of transparency. The Nigerian government has been known to not be transparent in terms of rolling out policies. So a lot of Nigerians do not know that subsidies still existed with the rollout of CNG conversions. And we also need to point our mind to the fact that the way this CNG was rolled out to Nigeria, it was symbolized to be the cheapest of alternative, a cheaper alternative to fuel. And as such, it forced a lot of public transport operators to convert. Basically, they converted their vehicles from running on petrol to run on compressed natural gas. And that conversion in itself was some form of cost that these drivers had bared just to be able to enjoy a sort of cheaper alternative. Now, in that instance, what has been symbolized or guaranteed to be a cheaper alternative is now nearing the price range of fuel in itself. It just looks like the entire process was in vain. So, what we're going to see is that and there's going to be and the only way these public transport operators would react is to raise up prices in terms of the services they deliver. So in translating that to the average Nigerian, what the average Nigerian expects is that there's an increment in transportation cost, and with the current economic reality, that is not a good development. And in the instance where we have hike in transportation costs, it just translated the fact that we're going to be grounded in some form of economic activities that should play out, but did not play out because people are going to limit their transportation. So again, it's just a situation whereby the Nigerian government is not being transparent in rolling out policies to its people.
I totally agree with you on your issue of the lack of transparency by the Nigerian government because I mean, it's one thing you remove subsidy on petrol, then you start subsidizing CNG. A lot of people, I'm sure, didn't know about the subsidy for CNG and knowing that the removal of it is one of the issues that is causing the hike because, like you earlier stated, they actually put it as an alternative, a cheaper alternative for fuel. But then if we're seeing that it's even, I mean, getting expensive, what do you think? I know that this is going to discourage a lot of people who haven't converted to pick that option. But what do you think the government can do? What are their options for them to be able to stabilize the price and ensure that it remains like a viable alternative to petrol?
Very interesting question. So first, and this was the theme that ran through my response in the first question, transparency. So the first policy move should be to set up a transparent pricing framework. So the report have said the NNPC Gas Limited, the Gas Retail Limited was responsible for the hike. So it would be nice if that entity can come out and break down what contributes to the price of CNG. Let's see how much it costs for the gas feedstock cost, the compression, the transportation, the taxes paid on it. Basically, let's see the whole structure, what makes up the price, be known to Nigeria. And then in the instance where subsidy regimes still exist, they should be transparent enough to let Nigerians know their plan, whether they have the resources to stick to that subsidy or how they gradually plan to phase out that subsidy so that operators and users can basically adjust. And I think one other fundamental problem is that we should understand the fact that first, subsidies in itself is not a bad concept. Uh, but we've always not subsidized the right thing in Nigeria. We're mostly subsidizing consumption. We don't subsidize production in itself. So another policy move would be to kind of structure that subsidy into some form of targeted support. Uh, so what I mean is that so if we could target to subsidize like the most essential component, basically maybe things like electricity for compression stations rather than the entire gas cost, that's a more productive way to utilize subsidy. And then for operators who have already converted, the government could also help step in some form of transitional subsidy in terms of offering them, say, rebates, tax incentives, or to basically match whatever grant or cost they offset so as to ensure that it beyond the price of fuel because it has been symbolized to be a cheaper alternative. And again, we also need to talk about infrastructure here. Infrastructure deficit to that price hike. I'm not sure about how the rollout of NG filling station has been nationwide. So again, we need transparency in that whole system as to how the government wants to um, make this whole CNG alternative work for Nigerians because a lot of Nigerians trusted that seeing as fuel prices were no longer subsidized, they needed a cheaper alternative fuel energy alternative, and that alternative is also going the trend of the way fuel is. So if the infrastructure that supports the CNG system can be expanded, and again, energy is something that needs to be solved. If we have reliable electricity for CNG compressor stations to run with time, because they are not going to go and offset extra energy costs in terms of, say, they want to run diesel backup stations, which basically means that if they have reliable energy costs, prices are going to be a bit stable to consumers. And I think my final point will just be on the fact that uh, we also need a lot of monitoring and communication. So if there's constant communication and transparency to the Nigerian public as to how the entire regime is working, how the entire thing is playing out, I think that Nigerians should be able to like buy in. So authorities need to monitor how prices are changing and how it's affecting different classes of users. So right now as it is, so for commercial drivers, I think there's a different subsidy regime. So their price hike wasn't as high as for some other classes of users. And the reason is because they don't want the cost of transportation to really jump up. So again, all of these things need to be more transparent so that the Nigerian people can be carried along.
Well stated, Aya. Let's move over to our final story where we look at the Tidjane Thiam's presidential bid in Ivory Coast. What does the Constitutional Council's decision to disqualify him signal about the strength or the fragility of their democratic institutions and the rule of law?
So first, I must say that interesting development was seen in Ivory Coast, and the presidential election slated for October 2025, which is next month, is already shaping up to be a textbook case of state capture. And the state capture is basically dressed in the clothing of constitutional order. So just to give listeners some form of context, Tidjane Thiam is a former Credit Suisse CEO, and he has come back to his country to run for president next month. And what played out is that the Constitutional Council disqualified him from running. And the justification he gave was that he was a French national at the time he registered, but there are reports to the effect that he renounced his French nationality before he came up to register for the election. So basically, it's a case whereby he's a big opposition figure. And what we've seen is that with the disqualification by the Constitutional Council, it does mean that the key oppositions for next month's election they've been disqualified. And so what this signals is that we're seeing an erosion of strong institutions in the region, not just in Ivory Coast, because this conversation also extends to the West Africa region. So it basically puts Cote d'Ivoire's democratic credibility to the test, because if you look at the current sitting governor Ouattara, he has been in power since as far back as 2011, and this dude is 83 years old. So it's also an old man holding on to power for years, and he's playing every presidential cycle. It brings up one gimmick or the other to extend the stay in office. So when you see things like this, when a high-profile figure like Thiam, who is a big opposition heavyweight, have been disqualified, it just creates that impression that the institutions that should be independent on their own are being used by the incumbent government to narrow down their political competition rather than to strengthen it. And for a country with a very checkered history, again, if we go back to as far as 2010, that disputed election in 2010 was one of the triggers for the civil war that subsequently came after. So again, for a country that has experienced contested elections and post-election crisis, this could further erode trust in the rule of law and basically does deepen the cynicism of the entire electoral process. And we're already seeing reactions because they've been, over the past few months, they've been a couple of protests. We just hope that this does not blow into a case of another civil war.
I mean, I was about to just ask you what do you think the implications will be, and you had just stated now that hopefully it doesn't run out through in another civil war and there've been like protests. But do you think they took the right decision? What's your thoughts on the decision of um the Constitutional Council? Do you think it was fair? And do you think that his exclusion would change or have any effect on the stability and its standing of the country in West Africa? And do you think that it would um, kind of like have an impact on the elections that are coming up? Do you think in terms of alliance, voting sentiments, um, and the balancing of the power, kind of?
All right, so to start out with the question on, do I think the decision of the Constitutional Council was fair? So for Tidjane Thiam, it's quite dicey because the rule is, if you have dual nationality, you cannot run for president. But again, he was reported to have renounced his French nationality before registering to contest in the election. So ideally, he met that requirement. So if he had done what the law said or what the law stipulates, he should be allowed to run. And it was disqualified on the ground that he was not qualified because he had dual nationality. But report says he has renounced his French nationality. So in that context, it's really not fair to Tidjane Thiam. But when you also extend it, because he was not the only one disqualified, you also see that other opposition heavyweights were also disqualified alongside him. And these other opposition heavyweights were not in a situation like him, who had like the dual nationality cloud over him. So again, it shows that it seems like it appears to be a conscious sabotage of the institution of the Constitutional Council by the incumbent government to basically narrow down its big opposition heavyweight. So that's problematic in itself because institutions like this should do the right thing and basically incite hope in the average Ivorian. But that's what it is. So in terms of what this can have in terms of impact, especially when you consider the context of the West Africa region at this point. So that decision is troubling, in my opinion, because for a while now, Cote d'Ivoire has been considered to be a relative anchor of stability. And that stability is instructive when you consider that the West Africa region has been plagued by coups and democratic setbacks in recent years, since the likes of Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. We've seen military coup in this country in the last few years, and they've also pulled out of the ECOWAS regional body, and then they set up their own alliance for Sahel states. So that is the context we really need to like see this form. And also, I've touched on this point before that the entire development risks sparking domestic unrest. We're already seeing that unrest playing out because there have been protests on the streets against the whole setup. And on the economic side of things, this can really deter investment because investors will be looking. This is the election year for the country, so they'll be looking to see how that transition of power will play out, and if there's a lot of risks, to rather go elsewhere with their investment. So again, it's a very, very dicey period for the country, and then in a region like West Africa, which is under a lot of pressure. Ivory Coast cannot afford to look like it is sliding backward democratically, and that's why a lot of spotlight will be on what plays out in the election next year. So, in my opinion, I think the incumbent government led by Equatorial will easily win because the opposition has been silent, sort of. But again, my fear is, are we going to see post-election crisis? The chances are really high, but again, I'm not a prophet, so let's see how it plays out.
I mean, it's interesting. Let's see how it plays out. But also, lastly, do you think he should challenge? What do you think his response is going to be? Is he going to challenge it in court? Because I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is he needs to challenge that decision to be able to say, if I renounced my French citizenship, I did qualify, and resort to the court to be able to make that decision if his disqualification was right. I mean, that's my first thought, to run to the court. Or what other redress do you think that he has, or what do you think he will do?
So again, that's interesting because there have been a power court decision before the Constitutional Council. So I think the High Court had ruled on the matter before, then it went up to the Constitutional Council. So the Constitutional Council serves as the highest authority for constitutional and electoral issues. But again, I'm not so familiar with the terrain and I'm not sure, but there's the option of going down to the Supreme Court. And I'm sure that TMA will be exploring every option on the table to push back against this development.
I agree with you. I think that if he wouldn't take it lying down, I think that he would challenge it and he would explore every legal option that he has. Thank you very much, Ayo, for joining us on today's episode. I appreciate your insights and your comments on the issues, your recommendations that were very, very, very sound. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure.
It's always a pleasure to have you as well. To all our listeners, this podcast is by SBM Intelligence. You can access our podcast by searching for SBM Intelligence anywhere you find podcasts. For deeper insight into our work, visit our website at sbmintel.com. Remember to connect with us on all our social media platforms. You can find us on X, Facebook, LinkedIn, Blue Sky at SBM Intelligence. That's all for today. Thank you for listening.